The Syrian civil war has become the largest humanitarian crisis worldwide. Since the first uprising in 2011, there have been an estimated 470,000 people killed, 6.3 million people internally displaced by violence, 5 million people who have fled the country, and 13.5 million people in need of humanitarian assistance. This chapter of Syria 360, A Crisis Not a Problem, will be jumping into the main stages of the conflict. Specifically, it will be detailing all the steps that transform the conflict from civil society demonstrations into a full-scale civil war with many regional and international actors. The conflict will be split up into 3 phases. The first is the genesis of the conflict, the second a regional conflict, and the last being characterized through international involvement. Phase 1. The genesis and buildup of the conflict. Conflict in Syria did not begin until 2011, but there were many precursors that led to what is seen today. In 1982, Hafez al-Assad, the father of the current Syrian president Bashar al-Assad, set the precedent for how the regime would respond to civil dissent by ordering the military to put down a Muslim Brotherhood uprising with brute force. More of the history before the conflict will be covered in the next chapter of this video series, but for the purpose of this chapter, Hafez al-Assad blamed the Brotherhood for corrupting Islam and being anti-Syrian, which in turn forced him to deploy all of his military might to quell the uprising. Estimates suggest that over 25,000 people in total were killed by government forces. Hafez showed the Syrian people that the Assad regime would not take kindly to uprisings and would use whatever force necessary to keep his regime alive. Fast forward to 2010. The Arab Spring began in December with the self-immolation of Mohammed Bouazizi. This act inspired protests that erupted across the Middle East and North Africa. Eventually, it forced longtime dictators in Tunisia, Yemen, and Egypt to step down. At first, Syria seemed invulnerable to political unrest as a result of powerful domestic security apparatuses, but eventually the notions of the Arab Spring made its way to Daraa, a small town in Syria. February 16, 2011. In the small southwestern city of Daraa, influenced by what they had seen on TV in the protests in Egypt, Tunisia, and Yemen, a group of teenage boys spray-painted anti-regime slogans on a school. This one in particular, written by a 14-year-old boy, says, "It's your turn, Dr. Bashar al-Assad," hinting at the idea that the Ba'athist dictatorship would be the next to fall. This was the very first act of defiance against the regime in Syria. The regime responded immediately with force by arresting and torturing the boy the next day. Once the boy gave up the names of who he was with, they were in turn arrested and tortured until they gave up names of others who had been there that night. All told, 23 boys were in custody. Families and friends of the imprisoned boys began to demonstrate, requesting their safe return. At first, the boys were not returned, so more and more people protested. Finally, on March 18th, a little over a month since the first boy was arrested, police fired upon the crowd of protesters and killed 4 people. At this time, the Mosque al-Amari had become the site of a continuous sit-in during the early stages of the protests. On the night of March 22nd, a military operation to end the sit-in ended up killing 12 civilians. To cover themselves for attacking people in a mosque, the government planted weapons and ammunition to make it seem as if the protesters were actually terrorists, and therefore the government was the hero saving their people from terrorists. Trying a route other than violence to quell the protests, Assad began to promise reforms to create stability. First, he granted nationality to 220,000 stateless Kurds. Secondly, he removed emergency law. And thirdly, he removed the Supreme State Security Court. Along with this, he promised to take steps to tackle corruption, reform the media, and other economic reforms to tackle unemployment. Although these reforms sounded nice, nothing really changed. Emergency law was replaced with counterterrorism law, which was used to detain thousands of activists, and the Supreme State Security Court was replaced with a special counterterrorism court. Therefore, nothing really changed for the everyday Syrian. The next day, during a large protest known as the Great Friday, 88 people were killed by security forces. Since protests did not subside as a result of the reforms, the regime went back to its violent ways. Tanks and thousands of ground forces deployed into Daraa, firing indiscriminately. Troops fired into homes, set fire to pharmacies, raided homes, and snipers even prevented medical personnel from reaching the injured. Thousands were taken by the security forces, many of whom were tortured and executed. In an attempt to end the siege, thousands marched carrying food, medicine, and to show their peaceful intent, olive branches. Up to 62 were killed, while snipers again prevented the injured from receiving medical attention. Lebanese media reports that several Hezbollah fighters, a highly trained and capable Lebanese Shia militia, were killed in Syria in defense of the Assad regime. This is important because it shows the beginning of the shift to a regional conflict, and that right from the beginning Hezbollah was actively, although not yet publicly, working to support the Assad regime. This was one of the first times Hezbollah was seen in connection to the civil war, and their level of involvement is still up for argument. Phase 2. In late 2011, early 2012, the Syrian civil war morphed from a civil society demonstrations and conflicts to a civil war and a regional conflict. Iran begins to offer material support to Assad. Iran and Syria have been allies since shortly after the establishment of the Iranian revolutionary regime in 1979. They continue to be staunch allies in the region for many reasons. Since the first demonstrations, Iran had been providing advice and technical expertise on riot control and mass demonstrations behind closed doors. By late 2011, this shifted and Iran began sending arms to Syria through the air. More importantly, Iran provided the much-needed financial support to the Assad regime that allowed it to keep its military intact despite a significant amount of desertions early in the conflict. The alliance between Syria and Iran began in 1979, and there are a number of reasons for their continued support of each other. If the Assad regime were to fall, it would most likely be replaced with a Sunni-led successor regime that could be a committed Iranian enemy, especially since Sunnis constitute about 75% of the population. This would benefit the Saudis, Iran's rival, who would have been the most active and vocal supporters of arming Syrian opposition. By keeping Assad in power, Iran is trying to maintain the Shia crescent, a crescent-shaped region of the Middle East where the majority population is Shia. Iran sees itself as the champion of anti-Israeli activism. Iran would lose credibility in this endeavor if Syria, a neighbor to Israel, was lost. Iran would lose its main transfer point of arms to Hezbollah in Lebanon if Assad were to fall. Iranian leadership sees Hezbollah as a large strategic asset because it sees it as a check on Israeli freedom of action against Lebanese and Iranian territory through its ability to fire a large number of conventional rockets on Israel. If it were to lose its ability to arm Hezbollah, it would lose some security and more credibility in its anti-Israeli activism. Therefore, it is very much in Iran's strategic interest to support Assad. January 2012. Jabhat al-Nusra, originally organized by a group of Islamic State of Iraq, now known as ISIS, announces its presence in the region. They are counter to the Assad regime and Iranian efforts to have a Shia-controlled government. Al-Nusra, led by Muhammad al-Jawlani, pictured here on the left, is known today as Jabhat al-Sham. The name change came in July 2016 when al-Jawlani announced the group split from al-Qaeda. In April 2013, al-Baghdadi, the leader of ISIS, unilaterally announces the absorption of al-Nusra into an expanded Islamic State. Despite this proclamation, al-Jolani refused to accept the claims of authority. This created two very powerful and committed militias pitted not only against the Assad regime, but also against each other for regional power. Al-Nusra is a powerful and extremely capable fighting force against the regime. It has handed Assad's forces with a number of its most significant defeats and losses since 2012. Hezbollah originally answered Iran's call for action in 2011 by assisting Assad through an advisory role, but that began to change in 2013. On April 30, 2013, Hezbollah's Secretary General, pictured here, gave a speech in which he acknowledged Hezbollah's efforts in Syria on behalf of the Assad regime. He goes on to warn that Syria's regional allies, quote, will not let Syria fall into the hands of America, Israel, or Takfiri, Sunni extremists, end quote. This was the first time he formally acknowledges their efforts. He further supported this notion on May 9th, saying that Syria would supply Hezbollah with quote-unquote game-changing weapons in response to Israeli airstrikes near Damascus. Hezbollah did not become fully active until May 19, 2013, when it led the ground assault on al-Qusayr. Rebels had controlled al-Qusayr since mid-2012 and threatened the regime's main lines of communication, which made it a big strategic point. Hezbollah fighters entered the town from the south, east, and west, and advanced northwards to fully clear al-Qusayr. This was a dramatic shift for Hezbollah. The extent of Hezbollah's contributions remain murky, but their impact on the battlefield in 2013 is without question. At the same time as this assault, Iran made a dramatic move by extending a $3.6 billion line of credit to Syria to buy oil products, which helped prop up the plummeting Syrian pound. Phase 3. International Involvement. On August 21, 2013, Assad turned his chemical weapons arsenal on civilians, killing almost 1,400 men, women, and children. More details of the attack itself and what happened will be covered in another chapter of this video series. With the death of so many innocent civilians and the fact that the attack broke international law, the U.S. government announced that it would begin providing military support to moderate elements among the Syrian opposition forces. In response to the threat of non-state actors obtaining chemical weapons and the concerns of spillovers beyond Syria and Iraq, the U.S. officially enters the region known as Operation Inherent Resolve. More of the U.S.'s footprint in the region will be covered by another chapter of the video series. On September 30, 2015, Russian military involvement officially began. Russia's Chief of Staff of the Presidential Executive Office, Sergei Ivanov, pictured here, laid out their objective. Quote, the military goal of the operation is strictly to provide air support for the Syrian government forces in their fight against the Islamic State. End quote. This began an intensive bombing campaign, informally known as Operation Retribution, against what they claimed were ISIS targets, but were really CIA-backed Sunni rebels. In early October, as Russia was beginning their attacks, Iran and Hezbollah expanded their roles by deploying fighters into the Hama and Homs provinces in western Syria. With all of this help, Assad's forces began to stabilize by mid-October 2015. March 14, 2016, Putin surprised the U.S. by announcing mission accomplished and that he would withdraw his main forces, although there was no Russian withdrawal. The only thing that changed with this announcement was that Russia stopped bombing CIA-backed rebels and began bombing ISIS, which was their main militaristic objective in the beginning. Starting in 2017, under the new leadership of President Trump and Secretary of Defense Mattis, the U.S. has begun adding personnel to Syria. U.S. Marines attached to the 11th Marine Expeditionary Unit quietly moved into Syria in February 2017. The Defense Department would not speak to the size of the detachment, but said it includes multiple artillery batteries as well as support personnel, including infantry Marines. Nearly 100 U.S. Army Rangers have moved into Syria. These elite operators, who usually operate in the middle of the night, arrived in armored vehicles confidently flying the American flag in an effort to show everyone they had arrived. These Rangers are no longer conducting counter-terror or advise and assist rules, but instead reassure and deter. Tuesday, April 4th, 2017. In the northern rebel-held Idlib province, one of the worst chemical bombings in Syria was carried out by the Assad regime. The death toll was reported as high as 72, including 20 children. The attack created international outrage as the U.S., Britain, and EU blamed the Syrian government for the carnage. U.S. President Trump said the attack had a big impact on him, and his, quote, attitude toward Syria and Assad has changed very much. Secretary of Defense Jim Mattis called the attack, quote, a heinous act and will be treated as such. The following Friday, April 7th, after meetings between Defense Secretary Mattis, Joint Chiefs Chairman General Dunford, the head of U.S. Central Command, General Joseph Votel, among many others, the U.S. military launched a cruise missile attack on a Syrian airfield. This was the first direct American assault on the government of President Bashar al-Assad. The operation, which was authorized by the Trump administration, was a direct response to the Assad regime's use of chemical weapons 3 days prior. Moscow and Syria were quick to denounce the attacks, calling it, quote, unjust and arrogant aggression, unquote. Moscow then announced that it would be pulling out of a pact with Washington to share information about warplane missions over Syria. In this picture, you can see the destruction the civil war has created. The top picture is of Homs in 2011, before the war broke out, and the bottom is from 2014. The pictures show the utter destruction of what once was a beautiful country, home to many different cultures and peoples. Now, as the war continues to rage, one can only hope for a peaceful future for all the innocent people who have had their lives changed forever. This ends Chapter 1 of Syria 360, A Crisis, Not a Problem. For more information, continue watching the video series. Chapter 2 describes the history of the region leading up to the conflict.